When you consider our planet's biodiversity, the sheer range and variety of life that exists on Earth, and then when you think about the threats to this diversity, what are the images that immediately come to mind? A polar bear stranded on a melting chunk of ice? Maybe a vast swathe of the Amazon deforested? Or perhaps stretches of coral reef bleached and slowly dying? All those images are on the mark. They are, indeed, evidence of biodiversity loss. But how about this image?
A supermarket aisle. It seems counterintuitive. Supermarkets appear as spaces of such range and abundance. But look a little closer and you'll soon realise they are, in fact, showcases of the staggering impact our global food systems are having on the planet's biodiversity, which is at risk more than you think and valuable in more ways than you know.
Biodiversity.
Biodiversity. We hear the word, but what does it really mean?
Biodiversity? How would you say?
No.
La.
I don't actually know.
Bio yo lo relaciono como que viene de vida y de diversidad como variedad.
ففكرة التنوع الحيوي كانت هو هذا التنوع انه في نفس ما في حشرات لها اهمية، نفس ما الانسان له اهمية، نفس ما الحيوانات لها اهمية، نفس ما الهواء له اهمية، فهذا
It affects us because we also are part of the biodiversity.
Biodiversity refers to the intricate mesh of all living things on Earth. Animals, plants, insects, microorganisms. But it goes way beyond just the existence of these different categories of living things. Biodiversity is the result of three intertwined features: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. The more complexity, variety, and intertwining, the denser the web of life becomes, the more resilience we see in the living world.
However, the losses are already mounting. In the past 50 years, wildlife populations have declined by an average 69%. It's an alarming statistic that many scientists say is propelling us towards the sixth mass extinction on Earth, a phase when species vanish much faster than they can be replaced.
While the previous 5 mass extinctions that took place over the span of the last 500 million years came about as a result of natural causes, what we're seeing now, though, is a phase of rapid extinction caused as a result of human activity. And one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss, industrialised agriculture.
Industrial agriculture based on chemicals derived from fossil fuels is the single biggest cause for biodiversity destruction.
Dr. Vandana Shiva is regarded as one of the world's most formidable environmentalists and food rights advocates.
There's a targeting of the biodiversity and an indirect effect on biodiversity. The targeting comes from the direct cultivation of crops for chemical inputs, which means you have to grow only monocultures, because if you create a wheat for a certain kind of fertilizer, then all wheats in the field have to be exactly the same. That's why today cultivated vegetable diversity is 93% gone. And then there's this direct destruction of habitats to grow not food, but animal feed and biofuel. In addition, the way we farm creates the context for biodiversity outside the farm. Just in the last 30 years, large amount of diversity of insects is gone. So within the farm, the soil biodiversity, the plant biodiversity, the fungi biodiversity, the bee biodiversity, the insect biodiversity is all being killed. And outside the farm, this system is destroying the habitats that allow biodiversity to thrive, and threatening the habitat of animals also means new emerging infectious diseases. The viruses that were healthy part of the virome of the animal becomes a new infectious disease of this animal, the human being.
If you want to understand how we got to this place, then you need to take a step back in history, because diversity is not something our global systems of production are very good at or set up for.
Agriculture at mass scale, producing enormous volumes of crops that are predictable, consistent, and affordable, has seen us forcing nature to operate like a factory, turning food into a commodity.
There are two steps by which food has been converted into a commodity. The first was the pre-industrial step, which is the colonial step, where lands like mine were colonized and the land that belonged to the peasants as a commons was made the property of England and rents were collected. $45 trillion was transferred from India to England in the 200 years of British rule. But worse, the commodities that were grown became trade commodities rather than what nourished the people. So the change of food as nourishment into food as a colonial commodity for trade led to famines of a large scale. The second commodification began when chemical agriculture was introduced in the name of the Green Revolution, and food systems were transformed to commodity production systems.
The Green Revolution that Vandana is talking about was one of the most dramatic developments in agriculture in the 20th century. From the 1940s onwards, technology that had already transformed food production in industrialised countries, especially the US, was exported, first to Mexico and then beyond the Western Hemisphere. In places like Zimbabwe, Turkey, Pakistan, India and Thailand, the impact was tangible within a decade or so of the agricultural technologies being implemented. Attention was focused on seeds and soil. High-yielding crops that were easier to harvest with machines were developed through skilled breeding and genetic modification. The soil was also supercharged, watered with modern irrigation systems, sprayed with pesticides, and enriched with synthetic fertilisers.
In the initial decades, it was hard to see the Green Revolution as anything but a success. Agricultural production jumped, harvests seemed more consistent, and the price of food plunged. And in some places, it actually prevented mass starvation.
In fact, in 1970, the American agronomist who led the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts.
It is true that the tide of battle against hunger has changed for the better during these past 3 years.
But beneath that shiny green machine were some really big problems.
When they introduced Green Revolution, you know what we thought? We thought it's something which is going to bring healthy to the people. But the little information we received, we analyzed it and we found it very, very complicated. And these are the transnational corporations who have their own agenda.
I'm calling Elizabeth Mpoful, farmer and former leader of Via Campesina, an international farmers' movement formed by 182 organisations in 81 countries. She's currently on her farm in rural Zimbabwe, where the internet connection can lag.
They want to destroy all the diversity of our food crops, which our ancestors have been growing for ages and ages. They were also talking much about increasing massive use of herbicides, chemicals, fertilizers in production systems. They cause a very big damage to the environment, the soil. So Green Revolution to us doesn't necessarily mean we are going to produce enough and feed the world.
We had 200,000 varieties of rice in India. Tall, feeding the birds, feeding the animals, feeding all the humans. And then they were turned into dwarf varieties for only growing the commodity. What this does is starve the soil of its share of food. Nothing goes back to the soil and your land starts to get desertified.
The transition in our food production, you could draw it back to the onset of Western-based supermarkets and them just having this voracious appetite.
Costa Georgiadis is one of Australia's best-known environmental educators who is passionate about regenerative agriculture, food production and community building.
When something gets bigger, it also means it has to simplify, have less things but more of them. And that's being sold as convenience. And so as a result, our food system has gone from hundreds and hundreds of species of plants that we eat down to very few. And whether you talk about that in the realm of fruit or vegetables, go to your average place for food and, you know, there's 3 or 4 apples, there's 4 or 5 pears. If you're lucky, corn is reduced to to, just a couple of species, and potatoes are equally reduced to just a few. So agriculture just became, how can we grow a lot and get it from a place where we can grow it cheaply to a place where we can get the maximum profit. So vegetables weren't grown for flavour anymore. They were grown for transportability. And to have that transportability, they had to be picked early. Otherwise, if they were soft, they couldn't travel the hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands of kilometres. This system has basically reduced food to an item. And how can we shift that item most successfully for maximum profit? If that means spraying, if that means dipping it in chemicals to extend the transport life, all of these things have combined to turn our food into a commodity-based system.
Manufactured seeds and synthetic fertilisers are at the heart of this commodity-based industrialised system. A small group of mammoth multinational corporations, Corteva, Bayer, ChemChina and BASF, in effect own and control key parts of what should be a primarily natural agricultural process.
Because crops are designed to meet certain requirements, a small group of species are selected at the expense of others. The plants are created to be responsive to certain chemicals, and crucially, the seeds are often designed to deliver high yields, but often for only a limited number of harvests. They're then traded on the commercial proprietary seed market. This whole process has played a key role in destroying crop species diversity. According to the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, 75% of the world's crop varieties disappeared between 1900 and 2000. A huge wealth of regionally specific, locally adapted crops has been replaced by standardized monoculture varieties.
When you shrink biodiversity to monocultures, you are eating just the same few commodities for calories, because a calorie became the measure, not the nutrition. And now the drive is how much royalty can the companies controlling the seed collect. And no one asked for soya bean as the most important crop. But anything you pick up in a supermarket has soya process. Even your sugar now is not true sugar. It's high fructose corn syrup from GMO corn. And this has, on the one hand, led to the erosion of biodiversity in our farms and in the forests, but it has led to an erosion of biodiversity in our gut in the last 20 years as chronic diseases have exploded. Doctors are turning to the fact that health begins in soil. Because the richer your soil is in diversity, the richer your plants are in nutritional diversity, as a result of which you're really nourishing yourself.
Then we come to the universe of agrochemicals.
From pesticides to herbicides to fertilisers. The key ingredient in factory farming is nitrogen fertiliser, which requires vast amounts of natural gas and even sometimes coal to produce. The problem is the massive over-application of nitrogen fertiliser over decades has damaged soil and caused nitrous oxide pollution. Nitrous oxide, by the way, is almost 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide.
Our soil is getting desertified because we created the idea that without synthetic fertilizers, we will not be able to grow food. And these synthetic fertilizers were made by the same techniques that made explosives. The same chemicals that were used to kill people in concentration camps were then adapted to be pesticides. The same Agent Oranges that killed people in the Vietnam War became herbicides. The same companies that sold chemicals, they adapted seeds to chemicals and therefore made monocultures, but then they adapted seeds through genetic engineering to more chemicals. A good seed, a living seed, an open pollinated seed, is inviting the bees and butterflies to work with it. That is a true living economy. When you start to control the seed, you kill all those relationships.
When you buy the seed, you're buying a system, and that system will mean that the seed could be pre-sprayed with a pre-emergent herbicide, so that when the seed comes out, there's herbicide there, but they've also been modified in a way that any seed on it is inert And if you want to plant again the next year, you have to go back. And that's a massive shift in history. And it will always be sold on as, well, we've done research and we've done this for these reasons. And so this is a market operation now because we're value adding and you'll pay for it, and you'll pay for it every year.
An indebted farmer will then already have locked their crop into paying back the debt for the fertilizers and the seed. So as soon as the crop is there, it's gone to pay the debt, and they're going hungry. And worse, they're in competition with each other to drive their own prices down. And then same farmer goes to buy rice as a commodity, which is 4 times more costly. So they go hungry because of the debt, and they get hungry because of the polarization and deceit in pricing of a globalized corporate-driven agribusiness system.
The tragedy of intensive farming is not just the loss of biodiversity, the decimation of soil systems, and the immense amounts of pollution. It's that the food security that was claimed to be the motivation behind all this industrialization, well, isn't secure. In most places where food is grown today, crop yields are lower because of more frequent heat waves, worse air pollution, droughts, and floods.
An agriculture that's contributing to climate change is also most vulnerable to climate change. A monoculture system will collapse with one change in rainfall, with one change in a monsoon, with one cyclone. But the biodiversity of the seeds the peasants have can see you through the cyclone because they bred for flood-tolerant, salt-tolerant seeds. They bred drought-tolerant seeds. So farmers breeding is what will see us through the climate resilience, because ecologically the principle is established. Diverse systems are resilient, monocultures are vulnerable to collapse. And we are following the monoculture path.
Where I am seated right now, this is one of the driest regions in Zimbabwe, where we just receive a very minimum rainfall. Some of us who are growing organically, agroecologically, we are going to have something enough to feed our families. I want to tell you, Ali, that those who really applied fertilizers in their crops, already there's totally nothing. If one gets maybe 20 kgs or 50 kgs, that person will be lucky because there are no rains. They are also shedding tears because they are not going to have enough food to feed their families. It's a crisis. It's a crisis.
The crisis of a world dominated by a limited number of proprietary seeds is not something scientists have taken lightly. Seed collections serve as insurance from the dangers of standardized crop strains, intensive farming practices, and increasing biodiversity loss. There are more than 1,700 seed gene banks around the world, and the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is arguably the most famous of them all. It's been dubbed the Noah's Ark of seed diversity, or the Library of Life.
I'm here in Svalbard in the Arctic Circle, just 1,300 kilometres from the North Pole. It's freezing cold, it's remote, and while it may not look like it, this place has a repository that holds more agricultural diversity than anywhere else on Earth. The Seed Vault provides long-term storage of duplicates of seeds conserved in gene banks around the world. The deposit taking place today is the largest since the Seed Vault opened in 2008. 170 boxes from 36 different seed banks around the world are being added to the collection, and that will bring the total number of unique species inside the vault to more than 1 million. Among first-time depositors are representatives from the UK, Lebanon, South Korea, and the first US tribe, the Cherokee Nation. All that happened back in 2020. I visited the vault just 2 weeks before COVID lockdowns began, and I spoke to agronomist and Seed Vault coordinator Åsmund Asdal.
So we have lost a lot of these farmers' varieties during the last 200 years. Luckily, we have gene banks that takes care of these varieties because they may have genes that we need when we produce these new varieties, adapting to changing climate, wetter climate, droughts, new plant diseases and so on.
With the Earth already experiencing temperatures that have never existed before in the history of agriculture, it's important to understand that it's our crops on the front lines. as genetic biodiversity is farmed out because of our need for stable, predictable, and industrial quantities of produce, species are losing the ability to evolve. And if our seeds aren't able to adapt to climate change, then neither will we.
If we do not have seeds, if we do not have the genetic varieties and genetic diversity within crops, we would not be able to develop agriculture. The climate is changing, we need more food, new plant diseases evolve, and then we need new varieties. And without the genetic diversity, we will not be able to produce the food, and we will actually not have food on our tables. So this is about existence of humanity, actually.
In 1991, Vandana founded the organisation Navdanya, which works to protect the biological diversity of seeds. Its aims are broadly the same as the Svalbard Seed Bank, but their methods are different. Navdanya collects indigenous varieties and saves them from extinction. In addition, the organisation promotes organic farming methods and protects farmers from dependence on patented seeds.
You know, there are two kinds of seed saving. One is knowing that it's living and must give life every day. It must be accessible to people if there's a drought. You can only have seed if you're growing the seed. There are two limitations with the idea of a Svalbard Big Bang. In a period of climate change, that snow will melt, and it did. It was flooded. The second is a package that big cannot supply seeds to 1 million farmers who might need it. 1 million farmers can supply seed to each other through exchange. But that little package of seed works fine if what you want is the next generation of genetic modification, which is gene editing. You want the next generation of patenting, which is through genome sequence reading. You don't do anything with the seed. The farmers did the breeding. You just do the genomic map and say mine. 2,500 climate resilient patents. So those packages are fine for that.
I've visited lots of seed banks. It's fine to have the seeds, but if you don't know how to germinate them, then it's kind of like just having records that you don't have a record player to play. But each and every one of those seed banks, their most proactive activity is the growing of the seeds, because we need those seeds growing so that they're adapting to a shifting climate. So that's where that idea of growing and saving, growing and saving, growing and saving every year, that's the incremental insurance, not just this case of tuck it away and hope for the best in 50 years.
The United Nations has forecast that by 2050, the world's population will grow to nearly 10 billion. Ideas on how to meet the world's food needs while global ecosystems continue to break down diverge considerably. There's one school of thought that advocates making tweaks to the current gene revolution to engineer plants to be more resilient to climate impacts. Others are calling for a completely different agricultural revolution, one that embraces traditional and indigenous farming practices. Grassroots farmers' movements like Via Campesina launched their vision of food sovereignty more than 25 years ago at the 1996 World Food Summit.
Food sovereignty is the right of people everywhere to produce food locally and sustainably through agroecological methods that respect the climatic, cultural, and geographical context of each region.
When we talk of food security, we just want to feed the people so that they don't go to bed hungry. But is this the right food which we are giving to the people? Do we know how it reached into Africa? Why is it so cheap? We are taking advantage of the droughts and bring dirty food to the people without taking consideration the healthy components, the nutritious components. But food sovereignty, it means you know very well how it has been grown. Food sovereignty, it also promotes my right to healthy food. I am independent in terms of production. So food sovereignty, you are food secure, you are in control of the whole system.
Food sovereignty means first you know you're part of the food web. And therefore, in your way you grow food, you must care for all life on earth. Increase the soil organisms and they'll give you more food. Increase the pollinators, they'll give you more food. You actually have more food by taking care of other beings. Intensify your biodiversity and you will have your nutrition per acre rather than yield per acre, which goes to the container ship. Food security for the farmer is just sell what you grow and have dollars in your pocket. And as we've seen, farmers will sell at low prices, buy food at high prices, will be indebted on the one hand and hungry on the other. So it is not a system that's nourishing them. Food seed sovereignty means seed is in your hands. Seed is diverse. Seed is renewable. Seed is within the commons. You can save and exchange seed and it has not been criminalized through intellectual property law. This will become more important as the same people who made lots of money through a bad food system are now thinking, oh, why don't we just grow corn and soya and grow carbohydrates and proteins and process food in labs and make fake meat and fake milk and fake this and fake that, and then new patents on artificial food. 14 patents for the Impossible Burger. So given how the rush to make profits out of food is going into a crazy hyperspin, it is becoming even more important to articulate, defend, and live food sovereignty.
Food sovereignty is all about community or a country understanding where their vulnerabilities are. If we're importing all this food, what happens when that plane doesn't come in? What happens when that ship doesn't come in? What happens when those trucks don't cross the border? That's where sovereignty is all about self-determination and self-control.
For decades, big multinational companies, pharmaceuticals, biotech, agritech, have been claiming intellectual property rights over biological materials, and they're doing it through patents. Patents allow companies that spend time and money on research to recoup their investment and profit from their work by giving them exclusive rights over their innovation for a set period of time. Companies patent seeds based on the genetic engineering they apply. However, this becomes quite problematic when traditional knowledge is involved. Vandana refers to what is happening in agriculture as bio-imperialism. She has devoted her efforts to fighting patents on seeds.
When I started to look at intellectual property and the idea that anything can be patented, and knowing that there's a new life sciences industry getting created, I said before you know it, they're going to patent all our indigenous knowledge and all our indigenous biodiversity. I wrote a book called Biopiracy. Before you knew it, our neem, which is a beautiful biopesticide, had been patented by the US government and a great company called Grace. We fought that case for 11 years. Our lovely basmati rice from my valley was patented by a Texas company. We fought that and had that patent knocked down. Our ancient wheats do not cause gluten allergy. The same companies that had created gluten allergy by growing monoculture wheats with chemicals, they now wanted to control and own our traditional wheats because there's a big market in gluten allergy. We fought that case and they had to give up that patent.
Patenting of life is stepping over the line, but it's stepping over the line by people who have the privilege and the power and the money to do it. They can get the legal and financial framework from which to do it and disguise it as, for the collective good. There's some things that cannot be owned. Seeds are one of those.
Biodiversity is the natural world's safety net to safeguard survival. Without diversity, there can be no adaptation. And without adaptation, extinction is only a matter of time. Industrialised, intensive agriculture is just one part of the wider biodiversity crisis, but it is the most significant part. At its root is a flawed system, one that is destroying the fundamental elements that make it work: soil, seeds, and the cycle of life.
I think we need to change the language around food because so much of it is around consumption and convenience. And that becomes this commodity, it becomes an item. It's not an item. Food is at the very heart of our ecosystems and our landscapes and our planet. but it also keeps our very heart going. These business models have enabled absolutely ludicrous outcomes when it comes to food, around distribution, around use by tastes and waste, around standards of what constitutes saleable. Some of these things, they're just atrocious, and they're being upheld by business. Food is the most intimate thing we engage with every day, and we bring it into our bodies. And when we start to think about it with that level of care and concern, then we'll give it the priority that it needs, and we'll craft a plan and a future that brings everyone together with a full plate, a full pantry, and a full fridge.
Human beings are not necessarily a destructive force on this planet. Indigenous people have taught us that we can be a regenerating force. Otherwise, we wouldn't have 80% of the biodiversity in the little bit of 25% of the land that indigenous people have been left with. We need to take a lesson from that. You want to bring back biodiversity? Live like indigenous people, do agriculture like indigenous people, relate to the earth as a living earth, the way indigenous people do. The paradigm shift has to be, we've got to get off the fossil fuel thinking, not just fossil fuels, but the thinking that came from it, the mechanical thinking, the industrial thinking, and shift to the biodiversity thinking. The biodiversity of the mind and biodiverse agriculture is what will bring us to the solution.
Thanks so much for watching this 9th episode of All Hail the Planet, a series looking at the forces undermining meaningful action on the climate crisis. If you'd like to check out any of the other episodes, we have a really broad range of topics, everything from psychology to carbon offsetting, green cities, tech optimism. If you'd like to check out those, you can easily use the hashtag AllHailThePlanet on social media. Otherwise, look for All Hail on aljazeera.com.